Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history that's going to make you incredibly grateful for your modern life.
Tonight, we're taking a journey back to medieval times, and I'm going to walk you through exactly why you, yes, you listening right now, wouldn't survive even 24 hours in the Middle Ages. We're talking about a world so brutal, so unforgiving, and so completely alien to everything you know that your morning routine alone would probably kill you.
From the moment you wake up until you try to fall asleep, every single aspect of medieval life was a constant battle against disease, violence, starvation, and a social system designed to crush anyone who wasn't born into nobility.
We'll explore the reality of medieval hygiene, the terror of medieval medicine, the back-breaking labor that filled every waking hour, and the constant threat of death that lurked around every corner. This isn't the romanticized version of knights and castles you see in movies. This is the real medieval world, where life was nasty, brutish, and incredibly short.
Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from.
Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together.
Let's start with your very first moments of consciousness in medieval times. You wake up, and immediately you're hit with the reality that there's no electricity, no gentle hum of an air conditioner, no soft glow of a digital clock, no smartphone to check the time or weather.
Instead, you're awakening to complete darkness if it's still night, or to the harsh, unfiltered light streaming through a small window if dawn has broken.
The window, by the way, doesn't have glass.
Glass windows were luxuries reserved for the wealthy, so you're looking at either an open hole in the wall covered by a piece of cloth or animal hide, or, if you're lucky, thin sheets of animal horn or oiled parchment that let in some light while keeping out most of the weather. The bed you're waking up on isn't the comfortable mattress you're used to. Medieval beds, even for those who could afford them, were essentially wooden frames with ropes stretched across them, topped with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, feathers if you were well off, or just rags if you were poor. Most people didn't have beds at all. They slept on the floor on thin mats or piles of straw, sharing space with their entire family, and often their animals. The straw in your mattress is old, probably infested with insects, mites, and possibly mice. You wake up covered in bites, your skin itching from bed bugs and fleas that have made their home in your bedding. Your first instinct might be to reach for a light switch, but of course, there isn't one. If you need light, you'll have to fumble around in the dark for a candle, and candles were expensive. Most people couldn't afford to burn candles regularly, so they simply went to bed when it got dark and woke up when it got light.
If you're a peasant, which statistically you would be, you might not even have candles.
Instead, you'd use rushlights, which were essentially reeds soaked in fat that would burn for a short time with a dim, smoky flame. Now, you need to relieve yourself. And this is where your modern sensibilities are going to take their first major hit. There are no bathrooms, no indoor plumbing, no toilet paper. If you're in a castle or manor house, you might have access to a garderobe, which is essentially a small room with a hole in the floor that drops down into a moat, river, or cesspit below. The smell is overwhelming, the hygiene is non-existent, and you're sharing this facility with everyone else in the building. If you're a peasant living in a small hut, you're looking at going outside to a communal latrine pit, or simply finding a private spot behind a tree or building. For toilet paper, you're looking at whatever you can find. Leaves, if they're available and it's the right season. Straw, corn cobs, stones, or pieces of cloth that you'll have to wash and reuse. The wealthy might have had access to soft wool or linen cloths, but most people made do with whatever was handy. The concept of personal hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist. You didn't wash your hands after using the bathroom because soap was a luxury item and clean water wasn't always available. Speaking of water, let's talk about what you're going to drink. You can't just turn on a tap and get clean, safe drinking water. Most water sources in medieval times were contaminated with human and animal waste, making them dangerous to drink. People knew that water could make you sick, even if they didn't understand why. So they typically drank ale, beer, or wine instead. Even children drank weak ale because it was safer than water. The fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria that would otherwise cause illness. But here's the problem. You're not used to drinking alcohol all day, every day. The alcohol content in medieval ale was typically lower than modern beer, but it was still alcohol, and consuming it from morning until night would leave you in a constant state of mild intoxication. Your judgment would be impaired, your reflexes slowed, and your decision-making compromised. In a world where quick thinking could mean the difference between life and death, this constant inebriation would put you at a severe disadvantage. Now, let's talk about breakfast, if you're lucky enough to get one. Most peasants didn't eat a morning meal. They might have a piece of bread left over from the day before, or they might simply start their day hungry and wait until their main meal later in the day. If you did have food available, it would be nothing like what you're used to. Bread was the staple food, but medieval bread was nothing like the soft white bread you might be familiar with. It was dense, often gritty from bits of millstone that got ground in with the grain, and frequently moldy or stale. The grain used to make bread was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Ergot poisoning was common in medieval times and was often called Saint Giovanna. Anthony's fire,
because of the burning sensation it caused in the limbs.
If you were unlucky enough to eat ergot-contaminated grain, you could experience terrifying hallucinations, lose consciousness, or even lose limbs to gangrene.
If you were fortunate enough to have other food available, it might include porridge made from oats or barley, eggs if you had chickens, or small amounts of cheese or milk if you had access to cows or goats.
Meat was rare for most people, reserved for special occasions or for the wealthy. When meat was available, it was often preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, making it tough, salty, and sometimes rancid. Fresh vegetables were seasonal and not always available, leading to widespread malnutrition and diseases like scurvy. The lack of proper nutrition would quickly become apparent in your energy levels and health. Medieval people were generally shorter and weaker than modern humans, partly due to poor nutrition throughout their lives. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to diseases like rickets, scurvy, and night blindness. Your immune system would be compromised, making you susceptible to every disease and infection that came your way. After your meager breakfast, if you had one, it would be time to start your daily work. If you were a peasant, which, again, you statistically would be, your entire day would be devoted to back-breaking agricultural labor. Medieval farming was done entirely by hand or with simple tools like hoes, scythes, and wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. There were no tractors, no mechanical harvesters, no modern fertilizers or pesticides. Your day would start before dawn and continue until after sunset, with only brief breaks for meals. The work was physically demanding in ways that would quickly overwhelm someone accustomed to a modern lifestyle. Plowing fields meant walking behind heavy wooden plows, guiding oxen through mud and rough terrain for hours at a time. Harvesting grain meant cutting it by hand with a scythe, then gathering it, threshing it to separate the grain from the stalks, and winnowing it to remove the chaff. Every step was labor-intensive and time-consuming. The tools you'd be using were primitive by modern standards. Medieval farming implements were made primarily of wood and iron, and they were heavy, awkward, and inefficient. A medieval plow was a massive wooden contraption that required enormous strength to operate. Scythes were sharp but unwieldy, and using one properly required skill and experience you wouldn't have. Hand tools like hoes and shovels were roughly made and would quickly raise blisters on hands not accustomed to such work. The physical demands of medieval farm work would quickly reveal how unprepared your modern body would be. Most people today, even those who exercise regularly, aren't conditioned for the type of sustained, full-body labor that medieval farming required. Your muscles would ache, your back would spasm, and your hands would be raw and bleeding within hours. The repetitive motions and heavy lifting would lead to injuries that, without modern medical care, could become serious problems. Weather was another constant enemy.
There were no weather forecasts, no protective clothing designed for different conditions, and no heated or air-conditioned spaces to retreat to when conditions became extreme. You worked outside regardless of whether it was raining, snowing, or blazingly hot. Medieval clothing was made from wool, linen, or leather. And while these materials provided some protection, they were nothing like modern synthetic fabrics designed for weather protection. In winter, you'd be working in conditions that could easily lead to frostbite or hypothermia. Medieval people had no understanding of how to prevent these conditions, and many suffered permanent damage from cold exposure. In summer, the combination of heavy physical labor and primitive clothing could lead to heat exhaustion or heat stroke. There was no understanding of the importance of staying hydrated or taking breaks to cool down. The social structure of medieval society would also work against your survival. If you were born a serf, which most people were, you were essentially a slave tied to the land. You couldn't leave your lord's estate without permission. You couldn't choose your own work, and you owed various obligations to your lord that could include working his land for free, paying taxes in grain or livestock, and serving in his army when called upon. Your lord had the power of life and death over you. He could punish you for perceived infractions, force you to work additional days without pay, or even sell you to another lord along with the land. The concept of individual rights as we understand them today simply didn't exist. You were property, and your lord could treat you however he saw fit. The legal system offered no protection for common people. Medieval law was based on the principle that those with power made the rules, and those without power followed them or faced the consequences. There were no public defenders, no presumption of innocence, and no appeals process. If you were accused of a crime, your fate was often decided by trial by ordeal, where you might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar, plunge your hand into boiling water, or undergo some other painful test. If you were injured in the process, it was considered proof of your guilt. Violence was a constant threat in medieval society. Warfare was almost continuous, with lords constantly fighting each other over territory, resources, or perceived slights. As a peasant, you could be conscripted into your lord's army with little or no training, given primitive weapons, and marched off to fight battles in which you had no stake. Medieval warfare was brutal and deadly, with high casualty rates and little medical care for the wounded. Even in peacetime, violence was a part of daily life. Disputes were often settled by fighting, and the strong preyed on the weak with little consequence. Bandits and outlaws roamed the countryside, robbing and killing travelers. Towns and villages were frequently raided by enemy armies, leaving destruction and death in their wake. The weapons you'd face were designed to inflict maximum damage. Medieval warfare relied on swords, axes, maces, and polearms, that could crush bones, sever limbs, and cause horrific wounds. Arrows from longbows could penetrate armor and pin victims to walls or trees.
Crossbow bolts could punch through chainmail and cause massive internal damage.
The psychological trauma of witnessing such violence would be overwhelming for someone from the modern world.
Medical care, when available, was more likely to kill you than cure you. Medieval medicine was based on superstition, religious beliefs, and theories that had no basis in scientific fact. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments were designed to restore balance by removing excess humors through bloodletting, purging, or inducing vomiting. Bloodletting was the most common medical treatment, used for everything from headaches to broken bones. Doctors would make cuts in your veins or use leeches to drain blood from your body, believing this would cure whatever ailed you. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients and often led to death from blood loss or infection. The tools used were unsanitized, spreading disease from patient to patient. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic procedures. If you were lucky enough to survive the pain and shock of having a limb amputated or a tumor removed, you'd then have to survive the inevitable infection that would follow. Surgical instruments were crude and often dirty, and surgeons had no understanding of the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection. Common injuries that we treat easily today could be death sentences in medieval times. A broken bone that didn't heal properly could leave you permanently disabled and unable to work, which meant starvation. A deep cut could become infected and lead to gangrene, requiring amputation or causing death. Even minor illnesses like the flu could develop into fatal pneumonia without proper care and nutrition. Dental care was virtually non-existent. Toothbrushes hadn't been invented, and tooth decay was rampant. When teeth became too painful to bear, they were pulled out with crude instruments and no pain relief. Many people lost most or all of their teeth by middle age, making it difficult to eat properly and leading to further malnutrition. Diseases that have been eliminated or easily treated in the modern world were major killers in medieval times. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century. Smallpox, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever regularly swept through communities, killing thousands. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no understanding of how diseases spread. Personal hygiene practices that would horrify modern people were considered normal in medieval times. Most people bathed only a few times a year, if at all. They wore the same clothes for weeks or months without washing them. Their hair was often infested with lice, and their bodies harbored fleas, mites, and other parasites. The smell must have been overwhelming, but people were so accustomed to it that they didn't notice. The lack of hygiene contributed to the spread of disease and made life miserable in ways we can barely imagine.
Skin conditions like scabies and ringworm were common.
Eye infections were frequent and often led to blindness. Respiratory infections were constant problems, exacerbated by poor air quality from cooking fires and inadequate ventilation. Women faced additional challenges that would make survival even more difficult. Medieval society was heavily patriarchal, and women had few rights and little independence. They were considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. They couldn't own land, make contracts, or participate in most trades or professions. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for medieval women. Without modern medical care, many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. Those who survived often suffered from permanent injuries or disabilities. Infant mortality was also extremely high, with perhaps half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. Women were expected to manage households, raise children, and often work alongside men in the fields or in family businesses. They had no labor-saving devices, no modern appliances, and no convenience foods. Everything had to be made from scratch, using primitive tools and methods. Cooking was done over open fires, which were dangerous and inefficient. Food preservation required skills and techniques that took years to master. The clothing available in medieval times would be another major challenge for modern people. Clothes were made from rough, scratchy materials like coarse wool and linen. They were expensive to make and were worn until they literally fell apart. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, which they wore continuously without washing. Medieval clothing was also impractical by modern standards. Garments were loose-fitting and often got in the way during physical work. There were no zippers, snaps, or Velcro, so clothes were held together with ties, pins, and crude buttons. Shoes were made from leather and provided little protection or comfort. Many people went barefoot, leading to injuries and infections. The social isolation of medieval life would also be difficult for modern people to endure. There was no mass communication, no television, radio, or internet. News traveled slowly, if at all, and most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Entertainment was limited to occasional festivals, storytelling, and simple games. Education was reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. Most people couldn't read or write, and they had no access to books or written information. Knowledge was passed down orally, and much of it was superstition mixed with bits of practical wisdom. The lack of education meant that people had no understanding of the world beyond their immediate experience, making them vulnerable to exploitation and unable to improve their circumstances.
The mental health challenges of living in medieval times would be enormous. The constant stress of survival, the fear of violence and disease, the grinding poverty, and the social oppression would take a severe psychological toll. There was no understanding of mental health issues and no treatment available. People who suffered from what we would recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health problems were often considered possessed by demons or cursed by God. Religion dominated every aspect of medieval life, but it was a harsh, unforgiving version of Christianity that emphasized sin, punishment, and suffering. People were taught that their miserable lives on earth were punishment for their sins, and that they should accept their fate without complaint. The promise of reward in the afterlife was used to keep people docile and prevent them from rebelling against their oppressive conditions. The church wielded enormous political and social power, and it used that power to maintain the status quo. Anyone who questioned religious authority or suggested alternative ways of thinking could be branded a heretic and face torture or death. The Inquisition actively sought out and punished anyone suspected of holding unauthorized beliefs. Environmental factors would also work against your survival in medieval times. Air pollution from cooking fires, forges, and other sources was severe in medieval towns and cities. Water pollution was widespread as human and animal waste contaminated wells and streams. Soil depletion from primitive farming methods led to declining crop yields and frequent famines. Climate change during the medieval period also created additional challenges. The medieval warm period, which lasted from about 950 to 1250 CE, was followed by the Little Ice Age, which brought colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons. These climate shifts led to crop failures, famines, and social upheaval that made life even more difficult for ordinary people. Natural disasters were particularly devastating in medieval times because communities had no way to prepare for them or recover from their effects. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, and severe storms could wipe out entire communities. There were no disaster relief agencies, no insurance, and no government assistance. When disaster struck, people were on their own. The economic system of medieval Europe was based on subsistence agriculture and barter rather than money. Most people never saw coins and had no understanding of complex economic concepts. They grew or made everything they needed, and they traded surplus goods for items they couldn't produce themselves. This system was inefficient and left little room for innovation or improvement. The lack of technological advancement meant that life in medieval times was essentially the same for centuries. Tools, techniques, and methods that were used in the early Middle Ages were still being used hundreds of years later. There was no concept of progress or improvement, and people expected their lives to be the same as their parents' and grandparents' lives. Transportation was primitive and dangerous. Most people traveled on foot, and those who could afford horses or carts still faced numerous hazards. Roads were little more than dirt paths that became impassable in bad weather. Bridges were rare, and rivers had to be crossed by ford or ferry. Bandits and wild animals posed constant threats to travelers. Communication over long distances was slow and unreliable. Messages had to be carried by human messengers who traveled at walking or horsing speed and were vulnerable to weather, bandits, and other delays. Important news could take weeks or months to travel from one part of the country to another. The lack of artificial lighting meant that productivity dropped dramatically during the winter months when daylight hours were short. People went to bed shortly after sunset and woke up before dawn, but the hours of useful work were severely limited. This seasonal variation in productivity made it difficult to accumulate surplus goods or wealth. Food storage and preservation were constant challenges. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, food spoiled quickly. People had to eat fresh foods immediately or find ways to preserve them through salting, smoking, drying, or fermentation. These preservation methods often changed the taste and nutritional value of foods and weren't always reliable. Seasonal food shortages were common, especially in late winter and early spring when stored foods were running low and new crops hadn't yet been planted or harvested. These hunger months were times of widespread malnutrition and starvation. People learned to eat things that we would consider inedible, including bark, roots, and even dirt, just to fill their stomachs. The constant struggle for survival left little time or energy for personal development, creativity, or leisure activities. Most people spent their entire waking hours working just to meet their basic needs for food, shelter, and clothing. There was no concept of hobbies, vacation time, or personal fulfillment outside of work. Social mobility was virtually non-existent in medieval society. If you were born a peasant, you remained a peasant for your entire life, and your children would be peasants after you. The rigid class structure was justified by religious teachings that claimed God had ordained the social order, and that attempting to change one's station in life was a sin against divine will. The lack of privacy in medieval society would be particularly difficult for modern people to adjust to. Peasant families often lived in single-room huts with their animals. Several generations might share the same small space, with no separation between sleeping, cooking, and living areas. Personal belongings were minimal, and there was no concept of individual space or possessions. Marriage was typically arranged by families for economic or political reasons rather than love or compatibility. Women had no choice in their marriage partners and were expected to submit to their husband's authority in all matters. Divorce was virtually impossible, so unhappy marriages were permanent sentences to misery. Child labor was considered normal and necessary for family survival. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute to household work and farm labor. They received little or no education and were often apprenticed out to other families or craftsmen at young ages. Childhood, as a distinct period of life with special protections and privileges, simply didn't exist. The legal system was based on local customs and the whims of those in power rather than written laws or consistent procedures. Justice was arbitrary and often brutal. Punishments for even minor crimes could include public humiliation, physical mutilation, or death. The concept of rehabilitation or second chances was unknown. Superstition and ignorance dominated people's understanding of the natural world. Natural phenomena that we understand today through science were attributed to supernatural causes. Eclipses, comets, and unusual weather were seen as omens or signs of divine displeasure. This ignorance made people vulnerable to fear and manipulation by those who claimed special knowledge or powers. The isolation of medieval communities meant that new ideas, technologies, and knowledge spread very slowly, if at all. Communities could be cut off from outside contact for months at a time, especially during winter. This isolation perpetuated ignorance and prevented the kind of cultural exchange that leads to progress and development. Entertainment options were extremely limited compared to modern standards. There were no books for most people to read, no theaters or cinemas, no recorded music, and no electronic media. Entertainment consisted mainly of seasonal festivals, storytelling, simple music and dancing, and various folk games and competitions. For most people, life was an endless cycle of work with very few breaks or diversions. The absence of artificial lighting meant that social activities had to be scheduled around daylight hours. Evening entertainment was limited to what could be done by the dim light of candles or oil lamps, which were expensive and often unavailable to common people. This meant that social interaction was severely restricted during the long winter months. Personal relationships were often pragmatic rather than emotional. Marriages were economic partnerships. Friendships were based on mutual advantage, and family relationships were defined by duty and obligation rather than affection. The romantic ideals that we associate with love and friendship today were largely absent from most people's lives. The physical environment was harsh and unforgiving. Houses were poorly constructed and provided little protection from the elements. Walls were often made of wattle and daub, which was essentially a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung plastered over a wooden framework. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, which leaked and needed constant repair. Floors were usually dirt or rushes that harbored insects and vermin. Heating was provided by central hearths that filled houses with smoke and created fire hazards. Chimneys were rare and often poorly designed, so smoke had to escape through holes in the roof or walls.
This created indoor air pollution that caused respiratory problems and eye irritation.
The constant exposure to smoke also increased the risk of fire, which could quickly destroy entire communities built of wood and thatch. Water supply was another constant problem. Wells were often contaminated with sewage and other pollutants.
Rivers and streams were used simultaneously for drinking water, waste disposal, and industrial processes like tanning and dyeing. The lack of understanding about sanitation meant that water sources were routinely polluted, leading to widespread disease.
Waste disposal was primitive and unsanitary. Human waste was often thrown directly into streets or waterways. Animal waste from livestock living in or near houses created additional sanitation problems. The smell and health hazards of these conditions would be unbearable for someone accustomed to modern sanitation systems. The tools and implements used in daily life were crude and inefficient by modern standards. Cooking pots were made of clay or crude metal and broke easily. Knives and other cutting tools were roughly made and difficult to keep sharp.
Simple tasks that we take for granted, like cutting bread or preparing vegetables, were much more difficult and time-consuming with medieval tools.
Textile production was an enormously time-consuming process that occupied much of women's time. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and then woven into cloth before it could be made into clothing. The entire process, from sheep to finished garment, could take months or even years. The resulting cloth was often rough and uncomfortable compared to modern fabrics. Food preparation was similarly time-consuming and labor-intensive. Grain had to be ground into flour using hand-operated mills. Bread had to be made from scratch and baked in shared community ovens. Meat had to be butchered, preserved, and cooked without modern appliances or conveniences. Meals were simple and repetitive, lacking the variety and nutritional balance that we expect today. The seasonal nature of medieval life created cycles of abundance and scarcity that modern people would find difficult to manage. Summer months brought long days of intensive farm work, but also fresh foods and mild weather. Winter months brought shorter days, cold temperatures, and the constant threat of food shortages. People had to plan months ahead and make careful calculations about food stores and fuel supplies. Weather prediction was impossible beyond simple observation of immediate conditions. Farmers had to plant crops and make other critical decisions without knowing what weather conditions to expect. A late frost, early winter, or summer drought could destroy months of work and threaten survival through the following year. The psychological impact of living with such uncertainty and lack of control would be enormous for modern people. We're accustomed to having detailed weather forecasts, insurance to protect against losses,
and social safety nets to help during difficult times. Medieval people had none of these protections and lived with constant anxiety about forces beyond their control. Social entertainment that we take for granted today was either non-existent or very different in medieval times. There were no restaurants, bars, or cafes where people could gather socially. Taverns existed in some towns, but they were often rough places associated with drinking, gambling, and violence, rather than refined social interaction. Sports and games existed, but were often violent and dangerous. Medieval football was more like a riot than an organized sport, with few rules and frequent injuries. Tournaments and jousts were reserved for the nobility and were often deadly serious affairs rather than entertainment. Common people might participate in archery contests or other skill-based competitions, but these were rare and limited in scope. The absence of mass media meant that people had no knowledge of events happening beyond their immediate vicinity. There were no newspapers, no radio or television broadcasts, and no internet to provide information about the wider world. People might go their entire lives without knowing about major events happening in other parts of their own country, let alone in distant lands. This isolation also meant that technological innovations and new ideas spread very slowly, if at all. A useful invention or technique developed in one region might take decades or centuries to reach other areas, if it ever did. This slowed overall progress and kept communities trapped in inefficient and outdated methods. The concept of individual privacy and personal space that we value today was completely foreign in medieval society. People lived in close quarters with extended family members, shared beds, and had little or no personal property. The idea that individuals should have private spaces or personal possessions that others couldn't access was largely unknown. Economic transactions were based on barter and personal relationships rather than standardized currency and contracts. This made commerce inefficient and created opportunities for disputes and exploitation. Without written contracts or standardized weights and measures, buyers and sellers had to rely on personal trust and reputation, which could be unreliable. The lack of standardization extended to many aspects of daily life. There were no standard measurements for distance, weight, or volume, making trade and commerce difficult. Time was measured differently in different places, and there were no standardized calendars or clocks. This made coordination and planning extremely difficult. Professional specialization was limited, and most people had to be generalists, capable of performing a wide variety of tasks. A medieval peasant might have to be a farmer, carpenter, blacksmith, veterinarian, and soldier all at the same time. This jack-of-all-trades approach meant that few people could develop deep expertise in any particular area. The absence of formal education meant that knowledge and skills were passed down through apprenticeships and family traditions. This informal education system was inefficient and often incomplete. Important knowledge could be lost if practitioners died before passing it on, and there was no way to systematically improve or build upon existing knowledge. Record keeping was minimal and often inaccurate. Without widespread literacy or standardized record-keeping systems, important information about crops, weather patterns, trade relationships, and other crucial data was often lost or distorted. This made planning and decision-making much more difficult and less reliable. The legal system was often corrupt and biased in favor of those with power and wealth. Justice could be bought, and the powerful could literally get away with murder, while the poor could be executed for stealing food. There were no public defenders or legal aid societies to help those who couldn't afford to hire lawyers. Migration and travel were extremely difficult and dangerous. Most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Those who did travel faced numerous hazards, including bandits, wild animals, disease, and hostile communities that viewed strangers with suspicion. There were no hotels, restaurants, or other travel infrastructure to support long-distance movement. The concept of retirement was unknown in medieval society. People worked until they were physically unable to continue, and then they depended on family members or charity for survival. There were no pensions, no social security systems, and no retirement savings. Old age was synonymous with poverty and dependence for most people. Disease and disability were viewed through the lens of religion and superstition rather than medicine and science. Physical ailments were often attributed to moral failings or divine punishment. Mental illness was particularly misunderstood and stigmatized, with sufferers often being accused of possession by demons or evil spirits. The treatment of animals was often cruel by modern standards. Working animals were viewed as tools rather than sentient beings deserving of care and protection. They were often overworked, undernourished, and subjected to harsh treatment. Wild animals were seen as threats or resources to be exploited, rather than as part of natural ecosystems deserving of protection. Environmental degradation was common, but not understood in terms of its long-term consequences. Forests were clear-cut for fuel and building materials without consideration for reforestation. Soil was depleted through intensive farming without understanding of crop rotation or sustainable agriculture. Water sources were polluted without understanding of the health consequences. The pace of life, while slower in some ways than modern life, was actually quite frantic due to the constant struggle for survival. People couldn't afford to rest or take time off because their survival depended on constant work. There were no weekends, no paid vacations, and no concept of work-life balance. Personal hygiene products and practices that we consider essential today were either unknown or available only to the wealthy. Soap was a luxury item. Toothbrushes didn't exist, and deodorants were unknown.
People used various herbs and natural substances to combat odors and maintain cleanliness, but these methods were largely ineffective by modern standards. The preservation of food required knowledge and skills that took years to master, and even then often failed. Salted meat could go rancid, stored grain could be consumed by rodents or insects, and preserved vegetables could spoil despite careful preparation. Food poisoning was common and could be fatal without proper medical care. Seasonal affective disorder and other mental health issues related to limited daylight and harsh living conditions were common but completely unrecognized and untreated. The long, dark winters, combined with poor nutrition, constant stress, and social isolation, created perfect conditions for depression and other psychological problems. The social pressure to conform to rigid behavioral expectations was intense and constant. Any deviation from accepted norms could result in social ostracism, physical punishment, or even death. Individual expression and creativity were generally discouraged in favor of conformity and adherence to tradition. Women's health issues were particularly poorly understood and treated. Menstruation was viewed as shameful and dirty. Pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous, and gynecological problems were often attributed to moral failings. Women had little control over their reproductive health and were expected to bear as many children as possible, regardless of the risks to their health. Child mortality rates were so high that parents often didn't allow themselves to become emotionally attached to infants until they had survived their first few years. This created a very different approach to parenting and family relationships than what we're familiar with today. The constant threat of violence meant that people lived in a state of hypervigilance that would be exhausting for modern individuals. Every stranger could be a threat. Every journey could end in robbery or murder, and every dispute could escalate into deadly conflict. This chronic stress would take an enormous toll on both physical and mental health. Agricultural techniques were primitive and inefficient, requiring enormous amounts of human labor to produce relatively small yields. The three-field system, which was considered advanced for its time, still left 1/3 of farmland fallow each year. Crop rotation was poorly understood, and soil fertility declined over time without proper management. Plowing was done with wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of hard-packed earth, and seeding was done by hand broadcasting, which wasted enormous amounts of seed and produced uneven crops. The tools available for farm work were crude and ineffective compared to modern implements. Scythes had to be sharpened constantly and were difficult to use properly. Flails for threshing grain were back-breaking to operate and often damaged the grain in the process. Hand sickles for harvesting were slow and required workers to bend over constantly, causing severe back problems. Livestock management was primitive and often counterproductive. Animals were allowed to graze freely, leading to overgrazing and soil erosion. Breeding was uncontrolled, resulting in small, weak animals that produced little meat or milk. Winter feed was inadequate, so animals often starved during cold months or had to be slaughtered in the fall, creating feast or famine cycles. The storage of grain and other food supplies was plagued by problems with rodents, insects, and moisture. Granaries were poorly constructed and offered little protection from pests. Rats and mice could destroy entire harvests, and insect infestations could ruin stored grain within weeks. Damp conditions led to mold and rot that made stored food inedible or dangerous to consume. Water management for agriculture was virtually non-existent. Farmers depended entirely on rainfall, with no irrigation systems or water conservation techniques. Drought years meant crop failure and famine, while excessively wet years could wash away topsoil and drown crops. Flooding was a constant threat that could destroy months of work in a matter of hours. The economic system provided no safety net for agricultural failures. When crops failed, farmers had no insurance, no government assistance, and no alternative sources of income. They were forced to sell their possessions, go into debt to their lords, or simply starve. This created cycles of poverty that could last for generations. Trade and commerce were limited by poor transportation infrastructure and the lack of standardized currency. Most transactions were conducted through barter, which was inefficient and led to disputes over the relative value of different goods. Long-distance trade was risky and expensive, so most people had access only to goods produced locally. The guild system, while providing some structure to crafts and trades, also stifled innovation and competition. Guild members were required to follow traditional methods and were prohibited from experimenting with new techniques or competing on price. This kept quality low and prices high while preventing technological advancement. Manufacturing was entirely done by hand, using primitive tools and techniques. Metalworking required enormous skill and strength, and the quality of metal goods was inconsistent and often poor. Textile production was extremely labor-intensive, with every step from fiber preparation to finished cloth requiring hours of manual work. The lack of precision tools meant that manufactured goods were crude and often poorly made. There were no standardized measurements, so parts were not interchangeable and repairs were difficult. Quality control was non-existent, so defective products were common and had to be accepted or discarded. Energy sources were limited to human and animal power, water wheels, and windmills. Most work had to be done by human muscle power, which was exhausting and inefficient. Water and wind power were unreliable and could only be used for certain types of work in specific locations. The lack of concentrated energy sources severely limited what could be accomplished. Lighting technology was primitive and dangerous. Candles were expensive and provided poor illumination while creating fire hazards. Oil lamps were smoky and smelly. Rushlights were cheap but burned quickly and provided very little light. Most people simply went without artificial light and conducted their activities during daylight hours. Heating systems were crude and inefficient. Central hearths filled buildings with smoke and created uneven heating. Firewood was often scarce and expensive, especially in areas where forests had been cleared. Many people simply endured cold temperatures without adequate heating, leading to health problems and decreased productivity. Cooking methods were primitive and time-consuming. Most cooking was done over open fires, which were difficult to control and created safety hazards. Pots and pans were crude and often broke or wore out quickly. Food preparation required enormous amounts of time and effort, with every meal needing to be made from scratch using basic ingredients. Food preservation techniques were unreliable and often failed. Salting, smoking, and drying were the primary methods, but they often didn't prevent spoilage completely. Preserved foods were often barely edible and provided poor nutrition. The lack of reliable preservation methods meant that people were vulnerable to starvation whenever fresh food wasn't available. The medical understanding of nutrition was virtually non-existent. People had no concept of vitamins, minerals, or balanced diets. They ate whatever was available and could afford, often resulting in severe malnutrition and deficiency diseases. Scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional disorders were common and often fatal. Dental health was universally poor due to the lack of understanding about oral hygiene and the absence of dental care. People often lost their teeth at young ages, making it difficult to eat properly and contributing to malnutrition. Tooth pain was treated with crude extractions or simply endured until the tooth fell out or the person died. Personal grooming was limited by the lack of appropriate tools and products. Hair was cut with crude knives or shears, often resulting in uneven and unattractive styles. Nail care was minimal, and nails were often broken, dirty, or infected. Skin care consisted mainly of washing with cold water and harsh soap when it was available. Clothing repair and maintenance required considerable skill and time. Garments had to be mended repeatedly as fabric was too valuable to discard. Washing clothes was difficult and time-consuming, involving hauling water, making soap, and scrubbing garments by hand. Many clothes were never washed and were simply worn until they fell apart. The social isolation of medieval life was profound and would be devastating for people accustomed to modern communication and social networks. Families might go weeks or months without seeing anyone outside their immediate household. News and information traveled slowly and was often distorted or completely inaccurate by the time it reached remote areas. Entertainment was scarce and often crude by modern standards.
Storytelling was the primary form of entertainment, but the stories were often repetitive and limited to local traditions. Music was simple and performed with crude instruments.
Dancing was energetic but limited to folk traditions that everyone already knew. Seasonal festivals provided brief respites from the grinding routine of daily life, but they were infrequent and often associated with religious obligations rather than pure entertainment. These celebrations were also opportunities for excessive drinking and behavior that often led to violence, injury, or unwanted pregnancies. The lack of intellectual stimulation would be particularly difficult for modern people to endure. There were no books, magazines, or newspapers for most people to read. Scientific knowledge was limited and often mixed with superstition. Philosophical and theological discussions were limited to religious authorities and were strictly controlled. Education beyond basic practical skills was reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. Most people couldn't read or write and had no access to formal learning. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, which was unreliable and often incomplete. Innovation and critical thinking were discouraged in favor of adherence to traditional ways. The legal system was arbitrary and often corrupt. Laws were made by those in power for their own benefit, and justice was available mainly to those who could afford to pay for it. Punishments were harsh and often disproportionate to the crimes committed. The concept of due process or fair trials was largely unknown. Property rights were limited and often ignored by those with power. Lords could seize peasants' property at will, and there was little recourse available to victims of theft or fraud. Contracts were difficult to enforce, and business relationships were based mainly on personal trust and reputation. The status of women was particularly oppressive. Women had few legal rights and were considered the property of their fathers or husbands. They couldn't own land, make contracts, or participate in most forms of commerce. Violence against women was common and rarely punished. Rape was often treated as a property crime against the woman's father or husband, rather than a crime against the woman herself. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement rather than a romantic relationship. Parents chose their children's spouses based on financial and social considerations rather than love or compatibility. Divorce was virtually impossible, and women were expected to remain in abusive marriages with no legal protection. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. There was no understanding of sterile procedures or proper prenatal care. Midwives had limited training and often relied on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Complications during birth often resulted in death for mother, child, or both. Child labor was considered normal and necessary for family survival. Children as young as 5 were expected to contribute to household work and were often sent away to work for other families. Education was limited to basic practical skills needed for survival. Childhood, as a protected period of development, was largely unknown. The treatment of elderly and disabled individuals was often harsh and unsympathetic. Those who couldn't work were seen as burdens on their families and communities. There were no social services or support systems for people with disabilities. The elderly were often abandoned or neglected when they could no longer contribute economically. Mental health issues were completely misunderstood and often attributed to moral failings or supernatural causes. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other mental health problems were often ostracized or accused of being possessed by demons. Treatment consisted mainly of prayer, exorcism, or physical punishment. The constant exposure to violence and death would be traumatic for modern people.
Public executions were common entertainment, and people were expected to witness brutal punishments as moral lessons.
Warfare was frequent and savage, with civilian populations often targeted for massacre or enslavement. Personal safety was never guaranteed, even in one's own home. Bandits and raiders could attack at any time, and there was little protection available from local authorities. Violent crime was common, and the strong preyed on the weak with few consequences. The primitive state of military technology and tactics made warfare particularly deadly. Soldiers fought with edged weapons and crude projectiles, resulting in horrific wounds and high casualty rates. Medical care for wounded soldiers was minimal, and many died from infections or blood loss that could be easily treated today. The psychological impact of living under constant threat would be severe. People had to remain constantly vigilant and ready to defend themselves or flee at a moment's notice. This chronic stress would take an enormous toll on mental and physical health, leading to premature aging and death. Environmental factors created additional hardships that modern people would find unbearable. Air pollution from cooking fires and primitive industries was severe in towns and cities. Water pollution from human and animal waste made many sources of drinking water dangerous. Noise pollution from metalworking, animals, and human activities created a constantly chaotic environment. Climate variability had dramatic impacts on daily life. A single bad harvest could lead to widespread famine and death. Unusual weather patterns could disrupt transportation, communication, and commerce for months at a time. People had no way to predict or prepare for these environmental challenges. Natural disasters were particularly devastating because communities had no effective ways to respond to or recover from them. Floods could destroy entire towns, earthquakes could level buildings, and fires could consume whole districts. Without modern emergency services or disaster relief,
People were left to cope with these catastrophes on their own.
The technological limitations of medieval society created inefficiencies and hardships in every aspect of life.
Simple tasks that we accomplish easily today required enormous amounts of time and effort.
Communication was slow and unreliable. Transportation was dangerous and expensive, and manufacturing was crude and labor-intensive.
The lack of scientific understanding led to ineffective and often counterproductive solutions to common problems.
Medical treatments often made patients sicker. Agricultural techniques depleted the soil, and manufacturing processes produced poor quality goods.
Without the scientific method, people had no reliable way to test and improve their methods. Social mobility was virtually non-existent, trapping people in poverty and limiting their opportunities for improvement. The rigid class structure was enforced by law, custom, and religious teaching. People were expected to accept their station in life without complaint and to pass on their social status to their children. The combination of all these factors created a life that was harsh, brutal, and short by modern standards. Most people died young from disease, violence, or malnutrition. Those who survived to old age often did so in conditions of poverty and suffering that would be considered intolerable today. The psychological resilience required to survive in medieval times was extraordinary. People had to endure constant hardship, loss, and suffering while maintaining the will to continue living and working. The mental toughness developed through this harsh existence was probably the only thing that made survival possible. Yet, even with this resilience, the quality of life was so poor that modern people would find it almost impossible to adapt. The physical demands, social restrictions, technological limitations, and constant dangers would overwhelm someone accustomed to the comforts and securities of modern life. The contrast between medieval and modern life is so stark that it's difficult to fully comprehend the differences. Every aspect of daily existence that we take for granted today was either non-existent or dramatically more difficult in medieval times. From the moment you woke up until you went to sleep, survival was a constant struggle against forces that modern technology and social systems have largely eliminated. The medieval world was not the romantic, chivalrous society often portrayed in popular culture. It was a harsh, unforgiving environment where life was cheap, suffering was common, and death could come at any moment from a dozen different causes. The vast majority of people lived in conditions that would be considered extreme poverty today, with no hope of improvement and no escape from their circumstances. Understanding these realities helps us appreciate the incredible progress that humanity has made over the centuries. The comforts, freedoms, and opportunities that we enjoy today are the result of countless innovations, social developments, and hard-fought improvements in human conditions. The medieval period
serves as a stark reminder of how difficult life can be without these advances. The resilience and adaptability that humans showed in surviving these conditions is remarkable, but it came at an enormous cost in terms of human suffering and lost potential. Millions of people lived and died in circumstances that prevented them from developing their talents, pursuing their interests, or achieving their potential. Modern people often romanticize the past and imagine that life was somehow simpler or more authentic in the earlier times. The reality of medieval life demonstrates just how wrong this perception is. Life was not simpler. It was more difficult in every conceivable way. It was not more authentic. It was constrained by ignorance, superstition, and social oppression that prevented people from living authentic lives. The lesson we can take from understanding medieval life is not nostalgia for a supposedly better time, but gratitude for the progress that has been made and determination to continue improving human conditions. Every advance in medicine, technology, education, and social justice represents a victory over the kind of suffering that was routine in medieval times. We should also remember that even today, there are people living in conditions similar to those that were common in medieval Europe. Poverty, disease, violence, and oppression still exist in many parts of the world. Understanding the medieval past can help us appreciate why it's important to work toward eliminating these conditions wherever they still exist. The story of medieval life is ultimately a story about human endurance and the gradual triumphs of knowledge over ignorance, justice over oppression, and compassion over cruelty. It reminds us that progress is possible, but not inevitable, and that each generation must work to build upon the achievements of those who came before. Your morning routine in medieval times would begin with the harsh reality of waking up in conditions that would shock any modern person. There was no gentle alarm clock to ease you into consciousness, no snooze button to grant you a few more precious minutes of sleep. Instead, you would wake to the sound of roosters crowing, church bells ringing for morning prayers, or simply the natural rhythm of your body responding to the first light of dawn filtering through whatever crude opening served as your window. The very act of getting out of bed would be an ordeal in itself. Your sleeping surface, whether it was a straw mattress for the relatively well-off or simply a pile of hay and rags for the poor, would be damp from condensation, infested with vermin, and often frozen solid during winter months. The straw would have broken down into sharp, scratchy pieces that would have worked their way through the rough cloth covering, poking and irritating your skin throughout the night. Bed bugs, fleas, lice, and mites would have feasted on your blood while you slept, leaving you covered in itchy, inflamed bites that would become infected from scratching with dirty fingernails. Your first conscious act would be to relieve yourself, and this simple modern convenience would become a nightmare of hygiene and social complexity in medieval times. If you lived in a town, You might have access to a communal privy, which was essentially a wooden bench with holes cut in it, positioned over a pit that was shared by dozens of families. The stench would be overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting organic matter, and the various substances people threw in to try to mask the smell. Lime, ash, and herbs were sometimes used, but they were expensive and often ineffective. The privy itself would be a source of constant danger. The wooden structures were often poorly maintained and could collapse without warning, sending you tumbling into the waste pit below. People died this way regularly, either from the fall itself, from drowning in the sewage, or from the diseases contracted from exposure to the concentrated waste. The seats would be rough, splintery wood that could cause cuts and scrapes, and in winter they would be covered with ice that could cause frostbite on exposed skin. If you were a rural peasant, your toilet facilities would be even more primitive. You might have a small shed with a hole in the ground, or you might simply find a private spot behind a building or tree to do your business. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and it was common for people to relieve themselves in semi-public areas, leading to contamination of water sources and the spread of disease. The absence of toilet paper would force you to use whatever materials were available. Leaves were the preferred option when they could be found, but they had to be the right kind of leaves at the right time of year. Many plants were poisonous or caused skin irritation, so choosing the wrong leaf could lead to painful rashes or even serious poisoning. In winter, when leaves weren't available, people used sticks, stones, pieces of cloth, or even handfuls of hay or straw. Wealthy people might have access to soft wool or linen cloths, but these were expensive and had to be washed and reused repeatedly. The concept of washing your hands after using the toilet was foreign to most medieval people. Soap was a luxury item that few could afford, and clean water wasn't always available. Most people simply wiped their hands on their clothes or rubbed them in dirt or sand. This lack of basic hygiene contributed to the spread of countless diseases and parasites that would have been easily prevented with modern sanitation practices. Your morning washing routine would be a far cry from the hot showers and modern toiletries that we take for granted today. Most people never bathed their entire bodies at one time. Instead, they might wash their face and hands in cold water from a basin, if water was available. The water would often be dirty, having been used by other family members or drawn from contaminated sources. In winter, the water would be ice cold or even frozen solid, making washing an ordeal of numbing cold and potential frostbite. Soap, when it existed at all, was harsh and crude, made from animal fat and ash. It would strip the natural oils from your skin, leaving it cracked, dry, and prone to infection. Many people made do with sand, ash, or rough cloths to scrub away dirt and grime, but these abrasive materials would damage the skin and create open wounds that could become infected. The wealthy might have access to perfumed oils or herb-infused waters for washing, but these were incredibly expensive and often reserved for special occasions. Most people simply lived with the accumulated dirt, sweat, and grime that built up on their bodies over time. The smell would be overwhelming by modern standards, but medieval people were so accustomed to it that they barely noticed. Your hair care routine would be equally challenging.
Most people never washed their hair, instead relying on combing and brushing to distribute natural oils and remove some of the accumulated dirt and debris. Combs were made of wood, bone, or horn, and they were crude, rough instruments that could damage hair and scalp.
Brushes were virtually unknown, and most people simply ran their fingers through their hair to detangle it. Head lice were universal in medieval times, affecting everyone from peasants to nobility. These parasites would cause constant itching and discomfort, and the only treatment was to manually remove them one by one, or to cut the hair very short.
Many people shaved their heads completely to try to control lice infestations, but the parasites would quickly return once hair began to grow back.
Hairstyles were limited by practical considerations and social conventions. Long hair was considered fashionable for women, but it was also a liability during physical work, as it could get caught in machinery or tools.
Men typically wore their hair shorter, but even short hair required maintenance that was difficult to achieve with medieval tools and techniques.
Dental care was virtually non-existent, and the results would be horrifying by modern standards. Most people never cleaned their teeth in any systematic way. Some might rub them with a cloth or chew on twigs to remove food particles, but there was no understanding of the importance of regular dental hygiene.
Toothbrushes wouldn't be invented for centuries, and the concept of daily tooth cleaning was completely foreign.
Medieval diets were particularly destructive to dental health.
The bread that formed the staple of most people's diets was coarse and gritty, containing particles of stone from the grinding process that would wear down tooth enamel. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it was consumed in large quantities when available, leading to rapid tooth decay.
The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant that people suffered from scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies that weakened teeth and gums. By the time most people reached adulthood, they would have lost several teeth to decay, and those that remained would be blackened, broken, and painful. Tooth pain was treated with various folk remedies, including chewing on herbs, applying hot poultices, or simply enduring the agony until the tooth fell out or the person died. When teeth became too painful to bear, they were pulled out with crude instruments and no anesthesia, a procedure that was often fatal due to shock, blood loss, or infection. The absence of mirrors would mean that you would have no clear idea of your own appearance. Mirrors were expensive luxury items made of polished metal, and they provided only a dim, distorted reflection. Most people went through life without ever seeing a clear image of their own face. This lack of visual feedback would make personal grooming even more difficult and would contribute to the generally unkempt appearance that characterized medieval life. Your clothing routine would be a study in making do with inadequate resources. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, which they wore continuously until they literally fell apart. The process of getting dressed would be complicated by the absence of modern fasteners. There were no zippers, no elastic, no snaps or Velcro. Instead, clothes were held together with ties, pins, and crude buttons made of wood, bone, or metal. Medieval undergarments were minimal and crude. Most people wore a simple linen shirt or shift next to their skin if they could afford linen at all. This undergarment would rarely be washed and would become increasingly dirty, smelly, and infested with parasites over time. There were no separate undergarments for different parts of the body, no underwear as we know it today, and no specialized clothing for different activities. The outer garments would be made of wool, which was warm but also scratchy, heavy when wet, and prone to shrinking and felting. Wool clothing would smell strongly of sheep and would retain odors from smoke, cooking, and body sweat. The dyes used to color cloth were expensive and often unstable, so most people wore clothes in natural colors ranging from dirty white to various shades of brown and gray. Putting on your clothes would be a complex process, especially for women, whose garments were often elaborate and required assistance to don properly. Layers of clothing were necessary for warmth, but they made movement difficult and created a perfect environment for parasites to thrive. The weight of multiple layers of wool clothing would be exhausting, especially when the fabric became wet from rain or sweat. Your footwear would be another source of constant discomfort and potential injury. Shoes were expensive luxury items that most people couldn't afford. Those who had shoes wore simple leather constructions that provided little protection or support.
The leather would be poorly tanned, prone to cracking and falling apart, and would become rigid when wet and then shrink as it dried, causing painful blisters and deformities.
Many people went barefoot most of the time, wrapping their feet in rags during cold weather. This led to constant injuries, infections, and deformities. Stepping on sharp objects, thorns, or animal waste was a daily hazard that could lead to serious infections. Frostbite was common in winter, often resulting in the loss of toes or entire feet. The process of preparing and eating breakfast would be a time-consuming ordeal that would test your patience and endurance. If you were fortunate enough to have food available for a morning meal, it would require extensive preparation using primitive tools and methods. Bread, the staple food, had to be made from scratch using flour that you had to grind yourself from grain that you had to clean and sort by hand. The grain would often be contaminated with dirt, stones, weed seeds, and various pests. Sorting through it to remove the inedible materials was a tedious process that had to be repeated every time you wanted to make bread. The grinding process, done with hand-operated mills or querns, was exhausting work that could take hours to produce even a small amount of flour. The flour itself would be coarse and gritty, containing particles of stone from the grinding process that would damage your teeth. It would also be prone to spoilage and would often be infested with insects or contaminated with mold. Making dough required water that might be contaminated, and the resulting bread would be dense, heavy, and difficult to digest. Baking the bread required access to an oven, which most people didn't have. Community ovens were available in some towns, but they had to be reserved in advance and paid for with scarce resources. The timing had to be perfect, as there was no temperature control and no way to monitor the baking process accurately. Many loaves were burned on the outside and raw on the inside, or were ruined by smoke from the wood fire used to heat the oven. If you were having porridge for breakfast, the preparation would be equally challenging. The grains had to be cleaned, sorted, and often ground or crushed before cooking. The cooking pot would be a crude iron or clay vessel that conducted heat unevenly and was prone to burning the food. Stirring required constant attention to prevent sticking and burning, and the resulting porridge would often be lumpy, partially cooked, and difficult to digest. Milk, if available, would come directly from cows, goats, or sheep that were kept in unsanitary conditions. The milk would not be pasteurized and would be full of bacteria and other contaminants. It would sour quickly in warm weather and freeze solid in cold weather. Many people were lactose intolerant and would suffer from digestive problems after consuming dairy products, but they had no understanding of the cause of their discomfort. Eggs, when available, would come from chickens that were kept in crude coops and allowed to roam freely, picking up parasites and diseases. The eggs would often be dirty, cracked, or partially developed. There was no refrigeration to keep them fresh, and they would quickly spoil in warm weather. Cooking them required careful attention to prevent burning, and there was no way to control the temperature precisely. The very act of eating would be complicated by the absence of proper utensils and tableware. Most people ate with their hands, using crude knives to cut food and rough wooden bowls or trenchers to hold it. Forks wouldn't be invented for centuries, and spoons were luxury items that few could afford. The lack of proper utensils meant that eating was a messy, inefficient process that contributed to the spread of disease and parasites. The workspace for food preparation would be primitive and unsanitary. Most cooking was done on the floor or on crude wooden tables that were never properly cleaned. Food preparation areas were shared with animals, and cross-contamination was inevitable. The lack of understanding about sanitation meant that raw and cooked foods were mixed freely, leading to food poisoning and other illness. Water for cooking and drinking would be a constant source of problems.
Wells were often contaminated with sewage and other pollutants, and there was no way to purify water or test its safety.
River and stream water was polluted with human and animal waste, making it dangerous to consume.
Many people drank ale or wine instead of water, but these alcoholic beverages were often contaminated as well and would leave you in a constant state of mild intoxication.
The fuel for cooking fires was another constant challenge.
Wood was becoming scarce in many areas due to deforestation, and it was expensive to purchase. Many people burned whatever they could find, including animal dung, straw, and even old clothing.
These materials burned poorly, produced acrid smoke, and provided inconsistent heat that made cooking difficult and unpredictable.
The smoke from cooking fires was a constant presence in medieval homes, as chimneys were rare and often poorly designed. Most homes had a simple hole in the roof to allow smoke to escape, but much of it would remain trapped inside, creating a chronically smoky environment that irritated eyes and lungs.
The smoke would also permeate clothing, hair, and bedding, adding to the general unpleasantness of medieval life. Food storage was a constant battle against spoilage, pests, and contamination.
There was no refrigeration, so all food had to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, drying, or fermentation. These preservation methods were unreliable and often failed, leading to food poisoning and waste. Stored food was constantly under attack from rats, mice, insects, and other pests that could destroy entire winter food supplies. The root cellars and storage areas where food was kept were often damp, poorly ventilated, and infested with vermin. Grain would mold, meat would spoil, and vegetables would rot despite careful storage. The loss of stored food could mean starvation during the lean months of late winter and early spring, when fresh food was unavailable and stored supplies were running low. Your workday would begin before dawn and continue until after sunset, with no modern conveniences to make tasks easier or more efficient. If you were a farmer, which most people were, your day would be filled with back-breaking physical labor, using primitive tools that required enormous strength and endurance to operate effectively. The very first task of the day might be milking cows or goats, a process that required skill and patience. The animals would be kept in crude shelters that provided minimal protection from the elements, and they would often be sick, injured, or malnourished. Milking had to be done by hand, a process that was time-consuming and produced relatively small amounts of milk. The milk would be warm and fresh, but it would also be contaminated with dirt, hair, and bacteria from the animal and the milking process. Feeding the animals would require hauling heavy loads of hay, grain, or other fodder from storage areas to feeding areas. The hay would often be moldy or infested with insects, and the grain would be expensive and carefully rationed.
Water for the animals would have to be carried by hand from wells or streams, a process that required multiple trips and enormous amounts of physical effort. The care of farm animals would be a constant source of problems and expenses.
Veterinary care was virtually non-existent, and sick animals were usually left to recover on their own or were slaughtered for food before they died naturally. Common animal diseases could wipe out entire herds, leading to financial ruin and starvation for farming families.
Plowing fields would be one of the most grueling tasks of medieval farm life.
The plows were heavy wooden contraptions that required enormous strength to operate and were pulled by oxen or horses that were often weak and malnourished. The plowshares were made of iron and had to be sharpened regularly, a task that required skill and access to a blacksmith.
The fields themselves would be rough and uneven, full of rocks, stumps, and other obstacles that could damage the plow or injure the animals.
Plowing had to be done at exactly the right time, when the soil was neither too wet nor too dry, and weather conditions could change rapidly, ruining days of careful work. Sowing seeds would be done by hand, a process called broadcasting that was inefficient and wasteful. Seeds were scattered by hand from bags or baskets, and there was no way to ensure even distribution or proper planting depth. Much of the seed would be wasted, eaten by birds, or would fail to germinate due to poor planting conditions. The seeds themselves were often of poor quality, saved from previous harvests that might have been contaminated with weeds or diseases. There was no understanding of plant breeding or genetics, so crop yields were low and unpredictable. A single season of bad weather could destroy an entire year's work and leave a family facing starvation. Weeding would be a constant battle throughout the growing season. With no herbicides or mechanical cultivation, all weeding had to be done by hand, using simple tools like hoes and hand weeders. This was back-breaking work that had to be repeated constantly, as weeds would quickly overwhelm crops if left unchecked. The tools used for weeding were crude and inefficient. Hoes were made of wood and iron and were heavy and awkward to use. They would become dull quickly and would need constant sharpening and repair. The handles were rough and would cause blisters and calluses on hands that were already raw from other types of manual labor. Harvesting crops would be the culmination of months of hard work, but it was also the most physically demanding time of the year. Grain crops had to be cut by hand using scythes or sickles, tools that required skill and experience to use effectively. The work had to be done quickly, as crops could be ruined by bad weather, and there was no way to predict when storms might arrive. Using a scythe required enormous physical strength and endurance. The tool was heavy and awkward, and using it properly required a rhythmic swinging motion that engaged the entire body. A skilled scythe user could cut grain relatively quickly, but the learning curve was steep, and beginners would tire quickly and achieve poor results. The cut grain had to be gathered into bundles called sheaves, tied together and left in the field to dry. This process, called stooking, required careful timing and attention to weather conditions. If the grain got wet while drying, it could rot or develop mold that would make it inedible. Threshing the grain to separate the edible kernels from the stalks was another exhausting process. It was done using flails, which were two pieces of wood connected by leather or rope. The grain was spread on a hard surface, usually a wooden floor, and beaten repeatedly with the flails to break the kernels loose from the stalks. This was dusty, dirty work that had to be done in enclosed spaces, creating clouds of chaff and dust that would irritate eyes and lungs. Winnowing, the process of separating the grain from the chaff, required waiting for the right wind conditions and then tossing the threshed grain into the air using baskets. The heavier grain would fall straight down, while the lighter chaff would be blown away by the wind. This process was weather-dependent and could be ruined by sudden changes in wind direction or speed. Even after all this work, the grain would still need to be cleaned and sorted to remove stones, weed seeds, and other contaminants before it could be ground into flour or cooked as porridge. This sorting process was tedious and time-consuming, but it was essential to prevent damage to grinding equipment and to avoid eating inedible materials. Your domestic duties would be equally demanding and time-consuming. Water had to be carried by hand from wells or streams, often over considerable distances. The water containers were heavy when full and had to be carried without spilling, a skill that took practice to master. Multiple trips were required each day to meet the needs of a family and their animals. The water sources themselves were often contaminated and unreliable. Wells could run dry during droughts or become contaminated with sewage during heavy rains. Streams and rivers could be polluted by upstream communities or by animal waste. There was no way to test water quality, so people had to rely on appearance, smell, and taste to judge whether water was safe to drink. Laundry was a major undertaking that could take an entire day to complete. Clothes had to be soaked, scrubbed, beaten, and rinsed repeatedly to remove dirt and stains. The soap was harsh and caustic, and it would burn hands and arms that were repeatedly exposed to it. The water had to be heated over fires, a process that required constant attention and large amounts of fuel. The actual washing process was physically demanding, requiring hours of scrubbing clothes against rough washboards or beating them with wooden paddles. Stains were difficult to remove, and many items of clothing were permanently discolored by dirt, sweat, and other substances. The wet clothes were heavy and difficult to handle, and wringing them out by hand was exhausting work. Drying clothes was another challenge, as there were no clotheslines or mechanical drying devices. Clothes had to be spread on bushes, draped over fences, or hung from crude wooden frames. Weather conditions could ruin a day's washing, and clothes that got rained on while drying would have to be washed all over again. Cooking meals was a complex and time-consuming process that required careful planning and constant attention. All cooking was done over open fires, which were difficult to control and provided uneven heat. The cooking pots were heavy and awkward, and they conducted heat poorly, leading to food that was burned on the bottom and undercooked on top. Preparing ingredients for cooking required extensive work with primitive tools. Vegetables had to be cleaned, peeled, and chopped using crude knives that were difficult to keep sharp. Meat had to be butchered and prepared without modern cutting boards or sanitary work surfaces. Grains had to be ground, sorted, and cleaned before they could be cooked. The timing of cooking was critical, as there was no way to reheat food once it had cooled. All components of a meal had to be ready at the same time, and this required careful coordination and planning. The lack of clocks or reliable timekeeping devices made this coordination even more difficult. Preserving food for long-term storage was a constant preoccupation that required specialized knowledge and skills. Meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, processes that could take weeks to complete and required constant attention to prevent spoilage. The salt used for preservation was expensive and often contaminated with impurities that could affect the taste and safety of the preserved food. Smoking meat required building and maintaining special smokehouses with carefully controlled fires that produced the right amount and type of smoke. Too much heat would cook the meat instead of preserving it, while too little heat would allow bacteria to grow and spoil the food. The wood used for smoking had to be carefully selected, as different types of wood produced different flavors and preservation effects. Vegetables were preserved through drying, fermentation, or storage in root cellars. Drying required warm, dry weather and protection from insects and other pests. Fermentation was a complex process that could easily go wrong, producing inedible or dangerous products instead of preserved food. Root cellars had to be properly constructed and maintained to provide the right temperature and humidity conditions for long-term storage. The household management tasks that fell primarily to women were numerous and demanding. Spinning thread from wool or flax was a constant occupation that required skill and patience. The spinning wheels or drop spindles used for this work were primitive and produced thread of uneven quality. The process was slow, and it could take weeks to produce enough thread for a single garment. Weaving cloth from thread was another specialized skill that required expensive equipment and years of training to master. The looms were large, complex devices that took up considerable space and required careful maintenance. The weaving process was time-consuming and physically demanding,
requiring hours of repetitive motion that could cause strain injuries and fatigue. Sewing and mending clothes was a constant necessity, as garments wore out quickly and had to be repaired repeatedly to extend their useful life. The needles were crude and often made of bone or wood rather than metal. Thread was expensive and had to be used sparingly, leading to repairs that were functional but not attractive. Making candles for lighting required collecting animal fat, preparing wicks from twisted plant fibers, and carefully controlling the temperature and timing of the candle-making process. The resulting candles burned poorly, produced acrid smoke, and had to be constantly trimmed and maintained to prevent them from guttering out. Soap making was another complex and dangerous process that involved handling caustic materials and maintaining precise temperatures and timing. The lye used in soap making was made from wood ash and water, and it was highly corrosive and could cause severe burns if handled improperly. The animal fat used in soap making had to be rendered and purified, a process that was smelly and time-consuming. Childcare in medieval times was complicated by high infant mortality rates and the lack of understanding about child development and health. Babies were swaddled tightly in cloths that restricted their movement and were rarely changed, leading to rashes and infections. There were no diapers as we know them today, and babies simply relieved themselves in their swaddling cloths, which would then have to be washed and reused. Feeding babies was another challenge, as there were no baby formulas or sterilized feeding equipment. Babies who couldn't be breastfed were fed animal milk or thin gruels using crude feeding devices that were difficult to clean and often harbored dangerous bacteria. Many babies died from malnutrition or diseases contracted through contaminated feeding practices. The medical care available for children was primitive and often dangerous. Common childhood diseases that are easily treatable today were major killers in medieval times. There were no vaccines to prevent diseases, and the treatments that were available were often based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Education for children was limited to basic practical skills needed for survival. Most children couldn't read or write, and formal schooling was available only to the wealthy. Children learned by observing and imitating their parents, and they were expected to contribute to household work from a very early age. The discipline of children was harsh and often violent. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary for proper child rearing, and children had no protection from abuse or exploitation. They were expected to obey their parents without question and to accept whatever treatment they received. So, as you go to sleep tonight in your comfortable bed, in your heated or air-conditioned room, with clean water available at the turn of a tap and medical care available when you need it, remember the countless generations who lived and died without these basic comforts. Remember the progress that has been made and the work that remains to be done to ensure that all people can live with dignity, security, and opportunity.
The medieval world was a place where most people truly wouldn't last a day under the conditions they would face. But it was also the foundation upon which our modern world was built, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the slow expansion of human rights, and the persistent effort to create better conditions for human life.
Understanding this history helps us appreciate how far we've come and inspires us to continue the work of building a better world for future generations.
Good night.